Morrison heard the screaming before he saw what was left of the convoy. He was 300 meters away when the first shell hit, close enough to feel the pressure wave slap the air out of his lungs, close enough to see the truck in the middle of the column lift off the ground like someone had kicked it from underneath. It hung there for a fraction of a second, suspended in fire and smoke, then came apart in the air. Metal, wood, bodies, all of it tumbling back to earth in pieces that had stopped being recognizable as human. He started running, not toward cover, toward them. The second shell landed before he made it 20 meters. This one hit the lead vehicle, a supply truck carrying ammunition. The explosion was different, sharper, hotter. A white flash that turned the whole road into a photograph. Negative for an instant before the fireball rolled upward in a column of black smoke. Morrison kept running. His ears were ringing, his vision blurred at the edges. He could taste copper and smoke. Behind him, someone was yelling at him to get down, to stop, to come back, but the words did not register as language. They were just noise underneath the high-pitched whine that had replaced all other sound. The third shell hit the rear truck. This one did not explode. It punched straight through the cab, through the engine block, and detonated under the chassis. The blast flipped the truck sideways into the ditch. The canvas cover caught fire. Morrison could see shapes moving inside, black silhouettes thrashing against the flames. Then the shapes stopped moving. He reached the convoy 30 seconds after the barrage stopped. 30 seconds was long enough for the fires to spread, long enough for the screaming to start, not long enough for anyone to have done anything useful. The road was gone. What had been a dirt track between hedgerows was now a crater field connected by burning wreckage. The lead truck was just a chassis and 4 wheels. Everything else had been vaporized or scattered across 60 meters of scorched ground. The middle truck did not exist anymore except as debris. The rear truck was on its side, flames pouring out of the cab and the cargo bed, thick black smoke twisting up into the gray morning sky. Morrison found the first body 10 meters from the middle crater. Face down, uniform shredded, no legs below the knees. He knelt, turned the man over, and saw Corporal Hayes, 22 years old, from Nebraska. Had shown Morrison a photograph of his girlfriend 3 days ago and talked about getting married when the war ended. Hayes was still breathing, short, wet gasps that bubbled in his throat. His eyes were open but not focused. Morrison pressed his hands against the stumps where Hayes' legs had been, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was too much of it and it was coming too fast. Hayes died in 45 seconds. Morrison felt it happen. Felt the breathing stop, felt the body go slack. He lowered Hayes back to the ground and stood up. His hands were red up to the wrists. Someone grabbed his shoulder. Morrison turned. It was Lieutenant Kern, another artillery officer, face pale, eyes too wide. "We need to pull back. They are still ranging us. If they fire again, we are all dead." Morrison did not move. "How many? What? How many were in the convoy?" Kern looked at the burning trucks. 12, maybe 13. "I do not know. Does it matter?" Morrison walked toward the rear truck. The fire was worse now. The heat pushed against his face like a hand. He could see the shapes inside more clearly. 3 of them. Burned black, fused to the metal frame. One of them still had an arm raised, frozen in the act of trying to climb out. He turned away and vomited into the ditch. When he straightened up, Kern was still there, waiting. "We need to move. Now." Morrison wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Where are they? Who? The guns. Where are the German guns?" Kern shook his head. "We do not know. Somewhere in the hills. Observation post called it in, but they displaced before counter-battery could range them. Same as yesterday. Same as the day before." Morrison looked at the hills to the north. Green, quiet, peaceful. Somewhere in that landscape. dug into a tree line or tucked into a fold in the terrain, was a battery of German artillery that could see this road, could range it perfectly, and could drop shells on it whenever they wanted, with no consequences. "How many times?" Morrison said. "What? How many times has this happened? How many convoys have they hit?" Kern hesitated. "This week, 4, maybe 5. Morrison walked back to where Hayes was lying. He knelt again, not to check for life. There was none, but to close the eyes that were still staring at nothing. When he stood up, his hands were shaking, not from fear, from something colder, something that felt like metal turning in his chest. He walked past Kern without saying anything, and headed back toward the command post. Behind him, the fires kept burning. The smoke column was visible for kilometers, a marker for every other German observer in the sector that the road was a kill zone, and the Allies had not figured out how to stop it. Morrison made it 200 meters before he had to stop and lean against a tree. He pressed his forehead against the bark and tried to breathe normally. It did not work. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hayes, saw the shapes in the truck, saw the moment the middle vehicle came apart in the air. 4 convoys, maybe 5, 12 men per convoy, maybe 13, 50 dead, maybe more, in 1 week, on one road, because a German battery could fire and displace. Faster than Allied counterfire could find them. He pushed away from the tree and kept walking. His mind was not on the road anymore. It was running through the problem, the same way it had been running through it for 6 days. You could not kill what you could not see. You could not see what moved every time you got close, and you could not get close without getting killed by the thing you were trying to find. The command post was a farmhouse with sandbags piled against the walls and a radio antenna poking out of the roof. Morrison walked past the guards without acknowledging them and went straight to the map room. The map was still there, same as this morning, same as yesterday. Red marks for known enemy positions, blue marks for Allied units. A dozen penciled circles in the hills where someone had guessed the German battery might be hiding. Morrison stared at the circles. 4 fire missions. 4 times they had pounded those positions with everything they had. 4 times the German guns had gone quiet, waited, then resumed from somewhere else. He heard boots behind him, turned. It was Major Hastings, the battalion fire direction officer. Older, competent, looked tired. "I heard about the convoy," Hastings said. Morrison did not respond. Hastings stepped up to the map. "We will hit them again. Sound and flash ranging has 3 new probable locations. We can have shells on target in 20 minutes. Morrison looked at him. "And then what? They move again. We kill some trees, maybe hit an empty field, and tomorrow they kill another convoy." Hastings did not argue. He knew Morrison was right. "So what do you want to do?" Morrison turned back to the map. He stared at the hills, stared at the penciled circles, stared at the blue marks showing where forward observer teams were positioned, all of them too far away to see the battery, all of them positioned that way because getting closer meant getting killed the moment you started transmitting coordinates. "I need a forward observer who can get close," Morrison said. "Close enough to see them fire. Close enough to call it in real time before they displace." Hastings shook his head. "You know what happens to observers that close. We lost Jenkins' team 2 days ago. 3 men, dead in 4 shells. The Germans have listening posts, direction finders. The second you start transmitting, they know where you are." "I know. So what are you proposing? Suicide?" Morrison did not answer. He was looking at the map, but not seeing it anymore. He was seeing something else. A shape. A vehicle. Something he had walked past every day for 2 weeks and never bothered to think about until now. He left the map room without explaining. Hastings called after him, but Morrison was already outside, walking fast across the muddy yard toward the motor pool. He passed supply trucks, jeeps, a pair of Shermans under camouflage nets. He kept walking until he reached the far corner where the reject equipment was parked. The stuff nobody wanted. The stuff that had been delivered by mistake or written off as useless. It was still there, under a torn camouflage net, covered in mud, looking like someone had tried to build a tank and run out of metal halfway through. The M22 Locust. Morrison stopped and stared at it. The vehicle was small, smaller than anything else in the motor pool, barely taller than a man. The turret looked like a tin can. The hull looked like it would crumple if you leaned on it too hard. The tracks were narrow. The gun was pathetic. A 37mm that could not hurt anything bigger than a half-track. He had seen it before. Everyone had. Soldiers walked past it every day and made jokes. Called it the toy tank, the joke tank, the airborne mistake. Some lieutenant had tried to get a crew to take it out on patrol 2 weeks ago, and the men had laughed in his face. Nobody wanted to climb into a vehicle that looked like a practice target. But Morrison was not looking at the armor. He was not looking at the gun. He was looking at the turret, at the radio antenna sticking out of the top, at the size of the chassis, at the way the whole vehicle sat low to the ground, small enough that at distance it might not register as a tank at all. He climbed onto the hull, pulled open the commander hatch, looked inside. 3 crew positions: driver, gunner, commander, an SCR 510 radio. The same model every other tank carried. The same model forward observers used to call in fire missions. Morrison stood on the hull for a long time. In his head, he was no longer seeing the Locust. He was seeing a German artillery battery, seeing their routine. Fire, displace, fire again, always moving, always one step ahead of counter-battery fire, because they knew Allied observers could not get close without dying. But what if the observer was not a man on foot with a radio? What if it was a tank, a small tank, a fast tank, something that could move, get close, call in coordinates, and run before the Germans realized what had happened? It was insane. The Locust had armor thinner than some armored cars. A direct hit from anything would go straight through both sides. The British had used them during Operation Varsity, and the after-action reports were brutal. The tanks attracted so much artillery fire that infantry had to pull back just to avoid casualties. 2 Locusts had been knocked out within hours. The rest had been classified as obsolete and never used again. But Morrison was not thinking about survival. He was thinking about haze, about the shapes in the burning truck, about 4 convoys in 1 week, about how many more men would die on that road if the German battery was not stopped. He climbed down from the hull and walked back toward the command post. He had an idea. It was reckless. It was desperate. It would probably get someone killed. But doing nothing was killing people faster. Morrison found Corporal Dennis 20 minutes later, sitting on an ammunition crate behind the motor pool with a rifle across his knees and a cigarette burning down to nothing between his fingers. Dennis was not smoking it. He was just holding it, watching the smoke curl up into the gray afternoon air the way you watch something you do not really care about but need to look at anyway, because looking at anything else means thinking about things you do not want to think about. Morrison had seen that look before, on men who had been forward observers, on men who had called in fire missions while watching enemy positions through binoculars and knowing that if the Germans had binoculars pointed back, they were already dead. Dennis had been one of those men until 3 days ago, until the Germans found his observation post and dropped 4 shells on it in under a minute. Dennis had survived because he had been outside the post when it happened, 20 meters away, taking a piss behind a hedgerow. His partner, Corporal Rains, had been inside with the radio. They found pieces of Rains scattered across 30 meters of field. They found the radio crushed into scrap the size of a fist. They found Dennis sitting against the hedgerow with his hands over his ears, not making a sound, just staring at where the observation post used to be. Morrison stopped 3 feet away and waited. Dennis did not look up. The cigarette kept burning. "You are Dennis," Morrison said. Dennis flicked the cigarette into the mud. "Yeah." Morrison crouched down so they were at eye level. "I need someone for a fire mission." Dennis laughed once, a short, ugly sound. "No, you do not. You need someone to get killed calling in coordinates the Germans are going to triangulate in 10 seconds. Find someone else." Morrison did not move. "I saw what happened to your post." Dennis looked at him for the first time. His eyes were red-rimmed. He had not been sleeping. "Then you know I am done. I am not getting back on a radio in range of German counter-battery. I would rather dig latrines for the rest of the war." "I am not asking you to sit in a foxhole," Morrison said. "I am asking you to drive." Dennis frowned. "Drive what?" Morrison stood up and gestured toward the far corner of the motor pool. "Come with me." Dennis did not move. Morrison waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then Dennis stood, slowly, picked up his rifle, and followed. They walked past jeeps, past supply trucks, past a Sherman with a blown track waiting for repair. Morrison kept walking until they reached the reject corner, where the unusable equipment sat under torn camouflage nets. He stopped in front of the smallest vehicle in the yard. Dennis stared at the Locust. Then he looked at Morrison. "You are joking." Morrison climbed onto the hull and pulled the commander hatch open. "I need someone who understands radios and can read terrain. You were a forward observer. You know how to call fire. You know how artillery thinks." Dennis walked around the Locust slowly, like he was inspecting a corpse. "This thing has armor thinner than a jeep. I have seen mess kits with better protection." Morrison nodded. "Which is why the Germans are going to ignore it. Look at it. It is barely bigger than a car. At distance, through field glasses, it looks like a scout vehicle. Maybe a self-propelled gun. Nothing worth wasting an 88 on when there are Shermans moving around." Dennis kicked one of the tracks. It made a hollow, tinny sound. "And when they figure out it is calling in fire on them." "Then you run," Morrison said. "This thing does 35 miles per hour. Fastest tank we have. You get in, get close enough to spot their battery, transmit coordinates, and get out before they can range you." Dennis looked up at Morrison. "How close?" 800 meters. Maybe less." Dennis laughed again. "Same ugly sound. That is suicide range." Morrison climbed down from the hull. He stood in front of Dennis and did not blink. "I watched Hayes die this morning. Watched him bleed out in 45 seconds. Watched 3 more men burn alive in a truck, because a German battery we cannot find keeps killing our convoys. 4 convoys in 1 week, 50 dead, maybe more. And every fire mission we call fails because our observers are too far away to get real-time coordinates." Dennis did not respond. Morrison kept going. "You want to dig latrines, fine, but that battery is going to keep killing until someone gets close enough to spot it. And the only way to survive, getting that close, is to be inside something that can move fast and does not look like a threat until it is too late." Dennis stared at the Locust for a long time. Then he turned and started walking away. Morrison watched him go. He had expected that. He had lost the argument. He would have to find someone else, someone younger, someone stupid enough or brave enough to climb into a vehicle everyone called a toy and drive it into artillery range. Dennis made it 10 meters. Then he stopped. He stood there with his back to Morrison, not moving, rifle hanging loose in one hand. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Rains had a kid. Did you know that? 8 months old. He showed me the picture the night before we got hit. Said he was going to teach the kid to fish when he got home." Morrison did not say anything. Dennis turned around. His face had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it was something else, something colder. "I am not doing this because I think it will work. I am doing this because I want to see that battery die. And if I die, making it happen. At least I die doing something instead of sitting here waiting for the next convoy to burn. Morrison nodded slowly. When can you be ready? Dennis walked back to the Locust and climbed onto the hull. He looked inside, checking the radio, the controls, the cramped interior. Then he looked at Morrison. I need one more man. Driver. Someone who knows how to push this thing hard without throwing a track. Morrison already had a name. Private Kowalski. Tank driver, good under pressure, had driven a Sherman through a minefield 2 weeks ago when the rest of his crew was wounded. Young, 20, dumb enough to volunteer for anything that sounded interesting. I will get him, Morrison said. Dennis dropped down into the commander hatch until only his head and shoulders were visible. The space inside was tighter than a Sherman. Darker. He looked around at the thin armor, the small gun, the radio that would broadcast his position the second he started transmitting. One question, Dennis said. Morrison waited. If this works, if we actually spot them and call it in and survive, what happens to this thing after? Morrison had not thought that far ahead. I do not know. Probably gets sent back to depot. Nobody else is going to want it. Dennis patted the turret. He almost smiled. Figures. Even if we pull this off, the Locust still ends up being the tank nobody wanted. He climbed out and jumped down from the hull. All right. Get me Kowalski. Get me a map of the sector. And get me every scrap of intel you have on where that battery has been firing from. I want to know their patterns, their timing, where they displace to, everything. Morrison felt something unlock in his chest. Not hope, just the absence of the weight that had been sitting there since this morning. You will have it in 2 hours. Dennis started walking toward the command post, then stopped and looked back. One more thing. If I call in coordinates and your guns do not fire, if there is a delay, if the fire mission gets scrubbed because some major decides it is not worth the shells, I am coming back here and shooting you myself. Morrison met his eyes. If you call in coordinates, shells will be in the air in under 2 minutes. I will be on the radio myself. No delays, no approvals. You give me a target and I will bury it. Dennis held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded and kept walking. Morrison watched him disappear into the command post. Then he turned back to the Locust. The vehicle sat under its torn net, small and pathetic and completely unsuited for what he was about to ask it to do. But it had a radio, it had speed, and it had a crew that wanted the German battery dead more than they wanted to stay alive. Morrison climbed onto the hull one more time and looked inside. 3 crew positions, barely enough room to breathe. Armor that would not stop a rifle round at close range. If this failed, Dennis and Kowalski would die in seconds. The Locust would burn just like the convoy trucks, just like Hayes, just like Rains. But if it worked, if they got close, if they transmitted coordinates before the Germans realized what was happening, if Allied artillery was fast enough and accurate enough, then one German battery would stop killing, one road would become passable, and 50 men would not have died for nothing. Morrison climbed down and walked toward the command post to find Kowalski and prepare the fire mission that would either prove the Locust was more than a joke or turn it into one more piece of burned scrap on a French hillside. Kowalski showed up at the motor pool 20 minutes later, and the first thing he did was laugh. He stood in front of the Locust with his hands on his hips and laughed hard enough that 2 mechanics working on a Jeep 30 meters away stopped and looked over to see what was funny. Kowalski pointed at the Locust, still laughing, and one of the mechanics shook his head and went back to work. Morrison waited. Let him get it out. Dennis, already in the commander hatch running radio checks, did not even look up. Kowalski wiped his eyes and walked around the vehicle. The laughter died, but the grin stayed. Sir, with all respect, this looks like someone tried to build a real tank, gave up halfway, and just welded a lunchbox to the top. "Get in," Dennis said from the turret. His voice was flat, dead, the voice of someone who had used up all his humor 3 days ago and had not found any more. Kowalski climbed onto the hull, still grinning. He dropped down through the driver hatch, and the grin vanished the second he saw the interior. Cramped, dark, hot, the kind of space where you could reach out and touch both walls without extending your arms. The visibility through the narrow periscope was a joke. Maybe 30 degrees of vision forward. Nothing to the sides unless he craned his neck hard enough to hurt. He sat down. The seat was thin metal with a pad that felt like it had been stolen from a tractor. His knees touched the front hull. His elbows touched the sides. If he leaned back even slightly, his head hit the radio mount. "This is cozy," he said. Dennis dropped down into the turret behind him. The space got tighter. Now Kowalski could smell him. Sweat, oil, cigarette smoke, the smell of someone who had not slept in days. "Start it," Dennis said. Kowalski hit the starter. The engine turned over with a high-pitched whine that sounded nothing like the deep rumble of a Sherman. It sounded nervous, fragile, like a machine pretending to be tougher than it was. Dennis pulled out a map and spread it across his lap. "Listen, both of you. This is simple. We drive up this road to this ridge, 800 meters from where we think the German battery is hiding. I glass the hills. I wait. When they fire, I see the muzzle flash. I call Morrison. You drive us off that ridge before their next shells land on our heads." Kowalski looked back over his shoulder. "How long do we have? Between them firing and us dying, 10 seconds, maybe 12 if they are slow." Kowalski turned back to the controls. His hands were on the steering levers. Steady. He had good hands. Hands that had driven a Sherman through a minefield 2 weeks ago while his commander bled out in the turret and his gunner screamed into the radio for a medic that never came. But those hands had been wrapped around the controls of a 30-ton vehicle with 5 inches of frontal armor. This thing had half an inch. You could punch through it with a good rifle at close range. "What if they shoot at us before we see them fire?" Kowalski said. "Then you drive faster. What if we throw a track? Then we do not. What if the engine dies?" Dennis leaned forward. His face was 6 inches from the back of Kowalski's head. "Then we die, in a broken toy tank on a French hillside, and Morrison fires on the battery anyway because he will see where their shells came from. Either way, they get hit. Either way, this ends. You want out, get out now. I will find another driver." Kowalski did not move. He stared through the narrow periscope at the motor pool outside, at the Shermans, at the normal tanks with normal crews doing normal things. Then he thought about the convoy this morning, about Hayes, about the 4 other convoys before that, about how many more there would be if nobody stopped the battery. "I am in," he said. "Good," Dennis said. "We leave at 0600. That gives you tonight to sleep or write letters or do whatever you do before you drive into artillery range in a vehicle with less armor than a truck." Dennis climbed out. Kowalski killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence. The motor pool sounds filtered in. Engines, voices. Somewhere far away, the low crump of artillery fire. Always artillery fire. It never stopped. Just changed distance, changed direction. A constant reminder that the war was not somewhere else. It was here, it was now. It was killing people while he sat in a toy tank wondering if tomorrow he would be one of them. He climbed out and dropped to the ground. A Sherman crew was walking past. 4 men, tank commander, gunner, loader, driver. They saw the Locust. The commander stopped. He was older, maybe 30, sergeant stripes. He looked at Kowalski, then at the Locust, then back at Kowalski. "They are putting you in that thing," he said. Kowalski nodded. The sergeant walked closer. He put his hand on the hull and pushed. The whole vehicle rocked slightly. He shook his head. I saw 2 of these in Operation Varsity. British used them, airborne assault. Both got knocked out in under an hour. One took a direct hit from a 75. Crew did not even have time to bail, just gone. Pieces of tank, pieces of men. Could not tell which was which. Kowalski did not respond. The sergeant kept going. The other one got hit by small arms fire. 30 caliber rounds went straight through the side armor. Killed the driver, wounded the commander. Tank rolled into a ditch and burned. He tapped the hull with his knuckle. This is not a tank. This is a coffin with tracks. Whatever they are asking you to do, say no. It is not worth it. Kowalski looked at the sergeant. What if I already said yes? The sergeant held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he stepped back. Then you better be lucky, because skill will not save you in that thing. He walked away. His crew followed. One of them looked back at Kowalski and made the sign of the cross. Kowalski stood alone next to the Locust. He put his hand on the hull the same way the sergeant had. The metal was cold, thin. He could feel how fragile it was, how easily it would come apart under the kind of firepower the Germans threw around like it was free. He heard boots behind him, turned. Dennis was back, carrying a canteen and a folded blanket. He saw Kowalski face. "Sherman crew, give you the speech," Dennis said. Kowalski nodded. "Let me guess. Coffin with tracks. Not worth it. Say no." "Yeah." Dennis set the blanket on the hull. "I got the same speech yesterday from a guy who saw me loading the radio. He told me forward observers do not last. Told me the Germans hunt them specifically because killing the spotter is easier than fighting the artillery. Told me Jenkins' team got hit so hard they could not find enough of Jenkins to bury." Kowalski waited. "I told him I know," Dennis said. "I told him I was there when they brought back what was left of Rains. I told him I helped scrape pieces of my partner off the inside of an observation post, while the medic puked in the corner. And I am still getting in that tank tomorrow because sitting here doing nothing while that battery kills another convoy is worse than dying trying to stop it." Dennis climbed onto the Locust and sat on the turret. He looked at the hills to the north. Somewhere in that quiet green landscape was the battery. Dug in, hidden, killing at will. "You do not have to come," Dennis said. "Morrison can find another driver. Someone younger, someone dumber, someone who does not know what happens when a light tank gets hit." Kowalski climbed up and sat next to him. They both stared at the hills. "I had a gunner once," Kowalski said. "Sherman crew, best gunner I ever saw. Could hit a moving target at 800 meters. We were advancing through a field and he made a joke about Shermans, called them Ronsons, lighters. One strike and they go up. 2 hours later, we took an 88 through the turret. I was driving. I felt the impact, felt the heat. I got out through the bottom hatch, pulled him out after me. Or, I pulled out what was left. He did not scream. There was not enough of him left to scream." Dennis did not say anything. "The thing is," Kowalski continued, "I knew the Sherman could brew up. Everyone knows. But we got in anyway because it was our job. And because not getting in meant someone else had to. This Locust, it is worse. It will not brew up. It will just come apart. But I am getting in tomorrow because 50 guys are dead. And I can either help kill the battery that did it, or I can sit here and watch the count go to 60, 70, 100. They sat in silence. The sun was going down. The motor pool was emptying. Crews heading to mess, to bunks, to whatever small comforts existed behind the front lines. Then they heard it. Distant, to the east, the unmistakable sound of a barrage, multiple guns firing in sequence. The kind of coordinated fire that meant someone was hammering a specific target. 5 seconds later, the explosions. Deep, rolling. The sound carried across the valley like thunder that would not stop. Dennis and Kowalski both turned toward the sound. They could not see it from here. Just the direction. Just the knowledge that somewhere a few kilometers away, shells were landing, on a road, on a convoy, on men who had woken up this morning and thought they might make it to tomorrow. The barrage lasted 30 seconds. Then silence. Dennis climbed down from the Locust. He did not look at Kowalski. He just walked toward the command post. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something colder, from the certainty that the battery had just killed again and would keep killing until someone put it down. Kowalski sat on the turret, alone. He looked at the hills, at the quiet, peaceful landscape that hid murder. He thought about the Sherman sergeant, about coffins with tracks, about how right the man was and how it did not matter. He climbed down and followed Dennis inside. They had 6 hours until dawn. 6 hours to check the engine, load the radio, test the transmission. 6 hours to do all the small things that might keep them alive for 10 extra seconds, when those seconds were the difference between calling in the coordinates and dying without making the call. Morrison met them at the command post entrance. His face was gray. You heard it. Dennis nodded. Another convoy. 4 trucks, 12 men, same road, same battery. Dennis pushed past him and walked inside. Kowalski followed. Morrison called after them. Fire mission is set. I will be on the radio myself. You call it. I execute. 90 seconds from your transmission to shells in the air. No delays. Dennis stopped. He turned. Make it 60. Morrison blinked. What? Make it 60 seconds. They will triangulate my transmission in 10. They will fire in 20. Shells land in 30. If your guns take 90 seconds, I am already dead, and my coordinates do not matter. Morrison stared at him, then nodded once. 60 seconds. I will make it happen. Dennis walked to the map table. He stared at the hills, at the suspected battery positions, at the ridge where the Locust would sit tomorrow and wait for the Germans to fire so he could see them and call them in and die, or survive, based on whether Kowalski could drive faster than physics allowed. Kowalski stood next to him. They both stared at the map. Tomorrow at 0600, Dennis said quietly. Tomorrow, Kowalski agreed. They did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. The mission was simple. Drive into range. Spot the battery. Call it in. Run. Live or die, based on 10 seconds and half an inch of steel that would not stop anything the Germans threw at them. Dennis turned and walked out. Kowalski followed. They went back to the Locust and worked through the night. Testing, checking, preparing. Neither of them slept. Neither of them talked. They just worked until the sky started to turn gray in the east and Morrison appeared with a thermos of coffee and a map case and a look on his face that said he knew he was sending them to die and hated himself for it and was doing it anyway, because 50 men were already dead and 12 more had died while they sat around talking. At 5:45, Dennis climbed into the commander hatch for the last time before the mission. Kowalski started the engine. The high-pitched whine cut through the pre-dawn silence. Every man in the motor pool who was awake stopped and watched. They watched the toy tank roll toward the gate. They watched it disappear into the gray morning. Some of them shook their heads. Some of them looked away. One of them, the Sherman sergeant from yesterday, stood and saluted until the Locust was out of sight. The road out of camp was empty at 0600. No convoys, no patrols. Just the Locust and the gray pre-dawn light that made everything look like a photograph, taken through dirty glass. Kowalski drove with both hands locked on the steering levers, and his eyes fixed on the narrow slice of road, visible through the periscope. The visibility was terrible. He could see maybe 20 meters ahead. Anything to the sides was guesswork. The engine whined behind him, high-pitched and fragile, like it was working too hard just to keep the small tank moving. Dennis sat in the commander hatch with his upper body exposed to the cold morning air. He had binoculars hanging around his neck and a map case strapped to his thigh. The radio was on. The frequency set. Morrison was already waiting on the other end. Dennis had tested it 3 times before they left. 3 times Morrison had answered immediately. 3 times Dennis had said nothing and switched off. They drove for 20 minutes without seeing anyone. The valley opened up on their left. Fields, hedgerows, the same landscape that had been killing ground for 2 months. Dennis scanned it through the binoculars, looking for movement, looking for the signs that meant Germans were watching them the same way he was watching for Germans. He saw nothing, just empty country, just the kind of quiet that could mean safety, or could mean someone was waiting for you to get close enough to matter. The road started to climb. The engine pitch changed, higher, louder. Kowalski downshifted and the Locust slowed but kept moving. The ridge was ahead. 200 meters, 100, 50. Dennis tapped the top of Kowalski's helmet twice. The signal to stop. Kowalski braked. The Locust shuddered and went still. The engine idled. The sound was too loud. In the silence of the early morning, it felt like they were announcing their presence with a siren. Dennis lifted the binoculars and glassed the hills to the north. The light was getting better. He could see details now, tree lines, folds in the terrain, the places where you would dig in an artillery battery if you wanted to stay hidden and still have clear lines of fire into the valley. He saw nothing. No movement, no smoke, no fresh earth. Just hills and trees and the kind of landscape that looked innocent until it killed you. He lowered the binoculars and waited. His hands were steady. He had thought they would shake, thought the fear would be worse. But sitting here in the open with half his body sticking out of a toy tank 800 meters from a German battery that had killed 62 men in 1 week, he felt nothing. No fear, no excitement, just a cold, empty focus on the thing he had come here to do. Find the battery, call Morrison, survive long enough for the shells to land. He raised the binoculars again, scanned left to right, slow, methodical, the way he had been trained, the way Rains had taught him before Rains stopped existing as anything more than a wet stain on the ground. Still nothing. Minutes passed, 5, 10. The sun was coming up. The gray light was turning gold. Details sharpened. He could see individual trees now, individual rocks. The lip of a farm road cutting through the hills 3 kilometers away. Kowalski's voice came up through the hull. Quiet. Tense. How long do we sit here? Dennis did not lower the binoculars. Until they fire. Could be minutes. Could be hours. What if they do not fire? Then we come back tomorrow and do this again. What if they see us first? Then we find out if you can drive as fast as you say you can. Kowalski did not respond. Dennis could hear him breathing. Short, controlled. The breathing of someone trying very hard not to think about the fact that they were sitting in a vehicle with armor thinner than a mess kit, waiting for a battery of German guns to notice them. Dennis kept scanning. The binoculars moved in slow arcs. Left, center, right, back again. He was looking for the things you could not see unless you knew what to look for. The unnatural straight line of a gun barrel. The faint haze of propellant smoke lingering in still air. The disturbed earth around a position that had been dug and covered in the last 24 hours. He saw nothing. 15 minutes, 20. Then he heard it. Distant, to the east. The sound that had become so familiar in the last 2 months that he could identify it in his sleep. Artillery, outgoing, multiple tubes firing in sequence. The deep crump, crump, crump of guns sending shells down range. Dennis swung the binoculars east, searched the hills. The sound was coming from somewhere in the middle ridge, a kilometer away, maybe less. He scanned the tree line, scanned the shadows. There, a flash, small, brief. The muzzle blast of a gun firing from a concealed position. Then another flash 20 meters to the left. Then a third, 3 guns, maybe 4. dug into the base of a tree line with camouflage nets and improvised cover. Dennis dropped the binoculars and let them hang. His hands went to the map case. He yanked it open, pulled the map. His eyes went to the grid coordinates. He found the ridge, found the tree line, calculated the position. "Got them," he said. He dropped down into the turret, grabbed the radio handset, keyed it. "Overwatch, this is Locust. Fire mission. Over." The response was immediate. Morrison voice, calm, professional. "Locust. This is Overwatch. Send it." Dennis read the coordinates, grid, distance, azimuth. The exact position of the battery that had been killing Allied convoys for 8 days. His voice was steady, flat. He could have been reading a grocery list. Morrison repeated the coordinates back. "Confirmed. Locust, we are firing in 60 seconds. Suggest you vacate the area. Out." Dennis dropped the handset, looked up at Kowalski. "Go! Now!" Kowalski did not hesitate. He jammed the Locust into gear and floored it. The tank lurched forward. The engine screamed. The tracks bit into the dirt road, and the whole vehicle shot forward like it had been kicked. Dennis grabbed the edge of the hatch to keep from being thrown out. He looked back at the hills, at the tree line where the German guns were, at the battery that had just fired and had no idea that in 50 seconds their position was going to be turned into a crater. Then he saw something that made his stomach drop. Movement. In the tree line. Not where the guns were. 50 meters to the right. A German crew, running, not toward cover, toward a single gun that Dennis had not seen before. A gun pointed not at the valley, but at the ridge. At them. "They saw us," Dennis yelled. "Kowalski, go faster." The Locust was already doing 35 miles per hour. The engine was screaming. The tracks were throwing dirt and stones. Kowalski had the accelerator buried, and the transmission was whining like it was about to tear itself apart. Dennis dropped into the turret and grabbed the hatch cover. He started to pull it shut. Then he stopped. If he closed the hatch, he could not see, could not know when the shell was coming, could not warn Kowalski to swerve or brake or do anything that might give them an extra second. He stayed up, held on, watched the tree line. He saw the flash. The muzzle blast was bright even in the morning light. A single gun firing. The German crew had ranged them, had fired. The shell was in the air. Dennis heard it. The sound every forward observer learned to recognize and hate. The freight train's scream of an incoming shell. High-pitched, getting louder, coming straight at them. He did not yell. There was no time. The shell was already there. It hit the road 10 meters behind the Locust. The explosion was massive. The blast wave hit the back of the tank like a hand shoving it forward. The Locust jumped. The front end lifted. For a fraction of a second, they were airborne. Then the tracks hit dirt again, and the whole vehicle slammed down hard enough to rattle Dennis' teeth. Kowalski fought the steering. The Locust swerved, fishtailed. The right track lost traction. They were sliding sideways toward the ditch. Kowalski yanked the left lever. The left track locked. The tank pivoted, straightened. The right track caught. They were moving again, still fast, still screaming down the road away from the ridge. Dennis looked back. The German gun crew was reloading. He could see them moving, ramming the next shell, traversing the barrel to track the Locust as it ran. 30 seconds until Morrison guns fired. Maybe less. But the Germans did not need 30 seconds. They needed 10. 10 seconds to load. 10 seconds to aim. 10 seconds to fire again. And this time they would not miss because the Locust was on a straight road with nowhere to go but forward. Dennis saw the second flash. "Incoming!" he screamed. Kowalski jerked the Locust hard right, off the road, into the field. The tank hit the soft ground and the tracks dug in. Mud sprayed. The engine bogged. They were slowing. The shell hit the road where they had been 2 seconds ago. The explosion was close enough that Dennis felt the heat, felt the shrapnel whip past, heard metal fragments ping off the thin armor of the Locust hull like hail on a tin roof. Kowalski gunned the engine. The tracks spun, caught. The Locust lunged forward through the field. Slower now, mud dragging at them, but off the road. Harder to hit. Dennis looked at his watch. 20 seconds since he called the mission. 40 seconds until Morrison guns fired. 40 seconds was forever. The German gun fired again. This time Dennis did not see the flash. He just heard the scream, closer, louder, coming right at them. The shell hit the ground 5 meters to the left. The explosion threw mud and stones against the side of the Locust. A rock, the size of a fist, hit Dennis in the shoulder, hard enough to knock him sideways. He grabbed the hatch rim, held on, did not fall. Kowalski was screaming. Not words, just sound. The sound of a man pushing a machine past its limits and knowing it was not enough. The Locust was doing maybe 20 miles per hour through the mud. The engine was overheating. The transmission was grinding. They were not going to make it. Dennis looked back one more time. The German crew was reloading. Faster now. They had the range. They had the target. The next shot would kill them. Then the horizon behind the tree line lit up. Not one flash, dozens. The synchronized fire of every American artillery battery in range. Morrison had not fired one gun. He had fired all of them. The shells hit the German position 3 seconds later. Dennis saw the tree line disappear, saw it turn into a wall of fire and dirt and shattered wood. The explosions were continuous, overlapping. The kind of barrage that did not leave anything alive in the impact zone. The German gun that had been firing at them was gone. The crew was gone. The entire battery position was gone. Just smoke and fire and the continuing thunder of American shells tearing the hillside apart. Kowalski brought the Locust to a stop. The engine idled. Both of them sat in silence, listening to the barrage, watching the hillside burn. Dennis realized he was shaking. Not his hands, his whole body. The adrenaline was draining out and leaving nothing but exhaustion and the weird electric feeling of being alive when you were certain you were about to die. The radio crackled. Morrison voice. Calm, almost casual. Locust. This is Overwatch. Targets destroyed. Confirm you are mobile. Over. Dennis grabbed the handset. His hand was shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He keyed it. Overwatch. This is Locust. We are mobile. Mission complete. Out. He dropped the handset, looked at Kowalski. Kowalski was still gripping the steering levers. His knuckles were white. His face was gray. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 minutes. You good? Dennis said. Kowalski did not answer for 5 seconds. Then he started laughing. Not funny laughing. The kind of laughing that happens when the only other option is screaming. He laughed until he ran out of air. Then he looked back at Dennis. We just got shot at by an 88 in a tank made out of tinfoil, and we are still alive. No, I am not good. I am never going to be good again. Dennis climbed out of the turret. He stood on the hull, looked at the burning hillside, at the smoke rising into the morning sky, at the place where 62 men worth of killing had just stopped. He thought about Hayes, about Rains, about all the men who had died on that road because nobody could find the battery, about how it took a toy tank and 2 desperate men and 60 seconds of radio time to do what weeks of normal operations could not. Kowalski climbed out and stood next to him. They both stared at the smoke. Think they will give us a medal, Kowalski said. Dennis shook his head. They will give us another mission. That is what they do. What if we say no? Then someone else gets in this thing and does it. Kowalski was quiet for a long time. Then he sat down on the turret. Think the engine is still good. Dennis sat next to him. I think we just found out this thing is tougher than anyone thought. They sat on the Locust and watched the barrage end. Watched the smoke settle, watched the morning light turn the valley gold. Somewhere behind them, Convoys would start moving again. Roads would open. Men would live through another day because a battery that had seemed unstoppable had finally been stopped. The toy tank had worked, and nobody would ever call it a toy again. They drove back into camp at 07:30, and the first thing Dennis saw was the body bags. 12 of them, lined up in a row outside the medical tent. Dark green canvas, zippers closed, tags tied to the ends. The convoy from last night, the one they had heard getting shelled while sitting on the Locust. The medical convoy with red crosses painted on the roofs that the Germans had hit anyway. Dennis looked at them and felt his stomach turn over. 12 more. 12 men who had woken up yesterday thinking they were safe because medical convoys were supposed to be protected. 12 men who learned the same lesson everyone learned eventually. The rules did not matter when you were in range. Kowalski saw them too. He made a sound in his throat. Not words, just a sound. He drove the Locust past the medical tent and did not look back. Every man in the motor pool stopped what he was doing and stared. The Locust looked like it had been dragged behind a truck for 10 kilometers. Mud caked on the tracks. Dirt streaked across the hull. A dent in the right side armor, where shrapnel had hit hard enough to leave a crater the size of a fist. Dennis sat in the commander hatch with his helmet off and his face gray. His hands were locked on the rim of the hatch. He had been holding on for the last 30 minutes and could not make himself let go. The muscles in his forearms were cramping, but every time he tried to release his grip, his hands started shaking worse. Kowalski brought the Locust to a stop. The engine died with a final grinding whine that sounded like it was giving up. He sat in the driver's seat and did not move, just stared straight ahead at nothing. Morrison was waiting. He walked over and looked at the Locust, at the dent, at the mud, at Dennis' hands still locked on the hatch rim. "Mission complete," Dennis said. His voice came out flat. "Dead. Battery destroyed. Multiple secondary explosions. Confirmed." Morrison pulled a paper from his jacket. "Reconnaissance just got back. Total destruction of the position. 4 guns, ammunition cache detonated." He paused. 20 minutes. From your first transmission to the last shell. 20 minutes to kill a battery that had been operating for 8 days. Dennis finally let go of the hatch. His hands shook. He climbed out and his legs almost gave out when he hit the ground. He caught himself on the hull. Morrison reached out to steady him, but Dennis waved him off. "I am fine. You are not fine." Dennis looked at the body bags outside the medical tent. Neither were they. "But we got the battery. That was the job. Job is done." Morrison followed his gaze. "That was a different battery. Eastern sector. Hit them at 0300. We did not even know they were there until they fired." Dennis felt something cold settle in his chest. "A different battery." Morrison nodded. "There are always more. You know that." Dennis knew. He had known before he ever climbed into the Locust. But knowing it in theory was different from staring at 12 body bags and understanding that the battery he had just helped destroy was one of dozens. That killing it had not ended anything, had not even slowed anything down, had just removed one piece from a board that had 100 more pieces waiting to move. Kowalski climbed out of the driver hatch. He dropped to the ground and stood there swaying. His face was pale. His eyes were unfocused. He looked at the body bags, looked at Dennis, looked at Morrison. "Is this what we are doing now?" Kowalski said quietly. "Chasing batteries, one after another, until we run out of batteries or we run out of luck." Morrison did not answer right away. He looked at both of them, at the exhaustion, at the 1,000-yard stares, at the way they were both holding themselves together with willpower and nothing else. "The general wants to see you," Morrison said. 1400 hours, HQ. Why? Because what you did worked. Because he wants to expand it. train more crews, use the Locust for forward observation missions across the sector. Dennis laughed once. A short, ugly sound. Of course he does. We got lucky once, so now he thinks it is a tactic. It is a tactic, Morrison said. You proved it. You got close. You called it in. You survived. That is more than anyone else has done. We survived because the Germans missed, Dennis said. His voice was rising. We survived because their fourth shell did not land 3 meters closer. We survived because Kowalski can drive, and because your guns fired fast, and because we got lucky. That is all. Luck, not skill, not tactics. Luck. Morrison did not argue. He just stood there and let Dennis finish. Dennis turned away. He looked at the Locust, at the toy tank that had somehow brought them back alive, at the dent in the armor that should have been a hole, at the tracks that should have thrown but did not, at all the small failures that did not happen and added up to survival. The Sherman sergeant from yesterday was walking over, the one who had told Kowalski the Locust was a coffin with tracks. He stopped 10 feet away and just looked at them. At the Locust, at the damage, at Dennis and Kowalski. You made it back, the sergeant said. Yeah, Dennis said. The sergeant walked closer. He put his hand on the dent in the hull, ran his fingers along the torn metal. Then he looked at Dennis. I told you it was suicide. You did. I was wrong. The sergeant's hand stayed on the hull. This thing should not have brought you back, but it did. That means something. He stepped back, nodded once, then walked away without another word. Dennis watched him go. Around the motor pool, other crews had stopped pretending not to watch. They were staring openly now, at the Locust, at the men who had taken the joke tank into artillery range and lived. Some of them looked impressed, some looked skeptical. One of them, a young private, looked scared, like he had just realized he might be next. A mechanic walked over with a toolbox. He crouched next to the Locust and started inspecting the damage. Transmission is shot. Suspension is bent. Engine is running hot. 2 days to fix, maybe 3. Why bother? Dennis said. The mechanic looked up. Because it worked. Because you made it work. He tapped the hull. This is not a joke anymore. This is the tank that killed a battery nobody else could touch. That is worth fixing. He went back to his inspection. Dennis and Kowalski stood in silence. Then Kowalski sat down. Just dropped. Right there in the dirt next to the Locust. He put his head in his hands. Dennis sat next to him. You all right? Kowalski did not look up. I can still hear them. The shells. The sound they make right before impact. That screaming sound. I keep hearing it. Even now. Even here. Dennis nodded. I know. Does it stop? I do not know. Rains died 3 days ago, and I still hear the shells that killed him every time I close my eyes. Kowalski raised his head. His eyes were red, wet, not crying. Just the look of someone who had been holding on too hard for too long. I thought killing the battery would feel different. I thought it would feel like we won something. But those body bags are still there. That new battery is still out there. And tomorrow, Morrison is going to ask us to get back in that thing and do it again. Yeah, Dennis said. He probably will. What if I say no? Dennis looked at the hills to the north, at the smoke still rising from where the German battery had been, at the roads that would open now, at the convoys that would move without getting shelled, at the men who would live because someone had finally done something. Then someone else climbs in, Dennis said. Someone younger. Someone who does not know what those shells sound like yet. And maybe they do not come back. Maybe they die, and we sit here knowing we could have stopped it. Kowalski was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up, wiped his face, looked at the Locust. I hate that thing. I hate everything about it. The size, the armor, the sound, I hate that I know exactly how I am going to die if we go out again." He turned to Dennis. "But I am getting back in. Because you are right. Someone has to, and if someone has to, it might as well be us." Dennis stood. The shaking in his hands had not stopped, but it was less. He looked at Kowalski. "We do not have to. Morrison can find other volunteers." Kowalski shook his head. "No, he cannot. Because nobody else is stupid enough or desperate enough to climb into that thing after seeing what happened to us. We are it. We are the crew. And if we say no, the program ends and the batteries keep killing and nothing changes." He was right. Dennis knew he was right. He hated that he was right. They walked toward the mess tent, toward food and coffee and the brief illusion of normalcy. Behind them, the mechanic was already pulling tools from his kit, already climbing onto the Locust, already beginning the work of making the toy tank ready for the next mission. At 1400 hours, Dennis and Kowalski stood at attention in front of a general they had never met and listened to him talk about resourcefulness and initiative and how their actions had opened a critical supply route. The general shook their hands, told them they were being recommended for Bronze Stars, told them the program was expanding, told them they would train other crews to do what they had done. Dennis and Kowalski said yes, sir, and thank you, sir, and stood perfectly still until they were dismissed. Outside the tent, Kowalski looked at Dennis. "Bronze Stars." Dennis shrugged. "Medals do not stop shells." They walked back across the camp. The sun was going down. The sky was turning red. Somewhere in the distance they heard it. The sound they both knew too well. Artillery fire, outgoing, then incoming, then the explosions, a new battery, a new sector, the war continuing exactly as it had before. Except now there was one. Morrison kept a photograph on his desk until he died in 1989. It showed the Locust with Dennis and Kowalski standing next to it, both looking exhausted, both still holding their helmets like they'd just climbed out. On the back he'd written, "The tank nobody wanted, the men nobody thanked, the 20 minutes that saved hundreds." His daughter found it after he died. She had no idea what it meant. If you know a veteran who did something important and never got recognized, drop their story in the comments. Let's give them the recognition the Army didn't. Subscribe because I've got 11 more missions like this lined up. Every single one was classified. Every single one was buried. Every single one deserves to be told.